So now we're going to take a dive into A Spoonful of Poison. Doesn't sound very pleasant, but that's the opening track. And the opening track opens with the lyrics. There it was rendered for me on the screen, the perfect version of myself, lifeless there, prismatic beauty, red, blue, green, and nothing else. That color system, that additive color system, to me it seems like that relates in some way to this landscape that you were talking about, where we have these orderly shapes and structures. Is there a significance to that red, blue, green additive color system, and or to the lifelessness of this perfect vision of the self?
I like everything you were saying just there. So good for you, Simon. Thank you for analyzing that and coming up with that. That's great. My thought on it is A Spoonful of Poison. I just kind of like this idea of it being like the first track is just kind of, I don't know, swallowing this like bitter thing. It's like, ugh, and it's like a perverse version of that Mary Poppins tune almost.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
anyway, I just like this idea of like eating this gross thing. But I also think the whole song is sort of about the various ways in which we kind of cope with our reality. You know, if it's weird drugs, or I think in the case of those opening lyrics, presenting some kind of avatar that's outside of yourself online. I think that's kind of a social media sort of thing. You know, the red, blue, green being like, I guess like a cathode ray screen. I don't think our modern devices use that anymore. I'm not sure about that actually, but just kind of that, I was thinking about like cathode ray tubes and kind of this artificial representation of a deeper reality.
Yes.
And so, yeah, I think it's just kind of about that, just like what you do to cope. You know, if you've got like a social media presence you rely heavily on, or weird drugs, or if you're like a performer, whatever you do to cope. And it's like kind of this idea that even though we use it to help us along, help us in our day-to-day lives, it is poisonous. It's like kind of this irony that it's bad for you, but you need it in order to get through the day.
In the part of the song where we have the two references to spoonfuls of poison, we have kind of a contrast between two different ways of being or coping. One of them is, you know, focused on structure and constructing identity. That's kind of oriented towards order, but right at the beginning of the song, we're recognizing that this kind of perfectionism leads to a lifelessness. Mm-hmm. And then we have an alternative way of being or coping, the weird drugs, and so on, which intentionally tends towards disintegration in the moments when that strategy appears to be working. There are ego deaths and reveals for you. For all the weird drugs that I'll never do, the first individual was saying, there are ego deaths and reveals for you. This individual who is kind of oriented towards disintegration with the hope of experiencing liberation, there's a spoonful of poison in that individual's eyes that the first person doesn't experience. For every drunk tear that I'll never cry, there's a spoonful of poison in your eyes. And yet the first individual has this different spoonful of poison waiting for them.
Yeah.
So there's a poison that awaits for those who desire framing, like reassuring structure and to be in control of how things are framed. But the frame becomes a cage, and then that leads to a poison too. Were you conscious of opening the record with kind of like this image of two different possible ways of poisoning oneself?
No.
But it's
um,
there are these two different possible ways of
yeah, yeah, for
poisoning.
sure. I do think it's interesting that you kind of brought up the kind of framed, constructed perfection, and then it being like the first song on the album, and then contrasting that with the growth of the flower at the end of the album. I
Yeah,
just
absolutely.
felt like pointing that out, but I like that, and I think the branching paths that both lead one to harm is also kind of an interesting idea, and it is something that has kind of interested me in the past. Is there's this kind of inevitability that some damage will get done. This is something that like I think about from time to time, which it's kind of funny. Relates to a video game called Half-Life, which you may or may not have heard of. It's very popular.
Mhm.
But in the first Half-Life video game, there's like this part. It like really struck me. It was like odd. It was like one of those odd moments from childhood because you like I don't know, you like find this visual metaphor and it sticks with you. I don't know if that ever happens to you, but I just remember in this game there's like this hallway and there's some water on the ground and there's like an exposed electrical wire, so the water is electrified, and so there's no way you can proceed with the rest of the game without getting at least hurt like a little bit. There's no way to like get through this scenario without just getting damaged like a little bit.
Mm.
And I don't know why that stuck with me the way it did, but I just think it's kind of an interesting design choice, and I think it's like they probably weren't even thinking about it like that at all. But for some reason, it really stuck with me, and I felt like it had some kind of deeper significance. That there's like scenarios like that where it's just there's nothing you can do about it. You're gonna have to get hurt a little bit to go
Yeah.
through, to go forward.
It's interesting though, in the analogy there with the game,
Hmm.
if one's played the game before and is aware that that is the quandary, then it's possible through being aware, you take your spoonful of poison, but with intention and knowing that that's part of the growth narrative, to complete the game, to progress in the game. And for me, the fact that within this very orderly song, where the voice that we're presented with is conscious of the risk of tending towards lifelessness of its trajectory, there's parts of that character that recognize a value in the other choice. There isn't a dismissal of either. There isn't a complete outright dismissal of either as just like, here's the obviously bad thing to do.
Yeah. I think that's worth noting.
Hideous and wonderful, we fall apart all at once. So this is the same voice that at the beginning is celebrating the perfect version, structure. That same voice is the song ends with recognizing there's some beauty, perhaps, or something. There's something about the falling apart that is beyond just being what this voice wants to avoid.
Yeah. I think for me, that line deals with performance, publicly displaying yourself, making yourself vulnerable, displaying your work or some inner piece about yourself. And I think that's also one of just like ways that one copes, but you open yourself up to all sorts of venomous conclusions should you choose to go that route.